Hello and welcome to Meta Ethics. This podcast is somewhat of a part 2 to the Bullshit Jobs podcast we did. So I don't think you need to watch that, but that might be worth checking out before this. We're going to be talking about Homo Deus and industrial society in its future, also known as the Unabomber Manifesto. Personally, I see some links to transhumanism and anti-natalism. I guess we'll just kind of riff on that. Did you see any place you want to take it?
Yeah, I think the transhumanist position is a really interesting kind of take or development of antinatalism, in the sense that you could just subsume or bypass the need for organic human beings engaging in this Promethean pursuit of technology and of progress. But you could literally extract the type of beings that can experience suffering. So we could just pass on the torch to AI kind of thing. And then, how is that? Do you see that as being compatible with the antinatalist? I know Det Benatar, I don't know how much he knows about AI, and I don't know enough about AI to make this comment. And really, no one is technically authoritative on this subject, because we don't know definitively where consciousness as a phenomenon, comes from. What is the cause? What is the solution to the hard problem of consciousness? What I'm referring to is the possibility of an AI becoming sentient and then it experiencing subjective experiences of particularly pain is what we're concerned about here. But you can envision a world in which we allow the human race and all living beings to die off, but we pass the torch to a race of superior machines
that only experience pleasure.
Well, they wouldn't have to have any subjective experiences at all, right?
Yeah, I feel like that. It's compatible, but it's also it's compatible with antinatalism, maybe. It depends how conscious and how much pleasure and pain these AI can actually experience, but it also seems in opposition to some of the fundamentals. There's no reason that there has to be any kind of intelligent life in the universe. So I was talking in comments with a YouTuber called Vegan Space Scientist, and we were disagreeing.
Is he a real space scientist?
Yeah, I think he is actually doing some degree at uni. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but so just forewarning, no animosity towards the guy. We live in the same city, but we were disagreeing quite profoundly about one aspect of antinatalism. That is, he's on board with it, but he's a utilitarian, and he thinks that the ideal universe is one in which there are living beings that are experiencing pleasure. And I quizzed him on this hard. I was like, okay, do you think we should just breed and engineer beings that are only experiencing orgasms 24/7? And he was like, if possible, that's the best. He's really stuck to it. I was like, wow, okay. But I disagree very strongly on that. Maybe this is something we can come back to later, but how possible is that really? But personally, if I see a universe where there's living beings and they're experiencing only pleasure, we can have a spectrum of all pain, all pleasure, and no living beings. And on that spectrum, where does the no living beings fall? Because I would put it, you could argue that it would be right in the middle, an equal amount of pain and pleasure, or you could argue that it's equal to all pleasure and no pain.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think...
But you have to make an even further claim, because you just said, in the second example, they were on par, so it's essentially indifferent. So do you take... I think that's Benatar's position, if I'm not mistaken, that in a world where you experience only pleasure...
He said it would be neutral.
Do you go further than that, or do you agree with that?
Well, I think I agree with that. In the previous antinatalism podcast we did, I mentioned the consent argument, but I think I have been convinced that consent is always sort of predicated on a harm. So even though maybe it unnerves me a little bit that you can just create life, I guess if there is going to be like literally zero harm, and inclusive within that is the risk that they're going to wish you didn't bring them in. If like that's completely impossible, then I guess you can't really say that it's wrong. Maybe I'll be convinced back, but so I think in every realistic scenario it's wrong, but at the moment we are talking about futuristic, unrealistic scenarios.
So not to focus too much on the book, but just for the listeners, like Homo Deus is a project of sort of positing what might be the possible course of the future. In particular, I would say like the 21st kind of century, and some of the, not just the technological changes, but the kind of political, social, existential problems that, questions that we must face as a result of those technological changes. So there's a materialist element, and then there's kind of a, layer of interpretation.
Yeah, I think if we start from bullshit jobs, bullshit jobs is, it talks about history, but the thesis of the book is very present day, right? And then Homo Deus is very much, where do we go from here, right? So bullshit jobs, it's talking about our current capitalistic society, like people are pretending to work, what's going to happen. And in the previous podcast we did, something that I was really interested in is like, okay, well, what's the solution? Where do we go from here? And I don't feel like we really landed anywhere. And then Homo Deus kind of expands on that a bit more, because it talks about the future, like maybe no one's going to have to work. Talks a bit about transhumanism. And then the Unabomber Manifesto, that's like outrightly proposing a solution. It's like we should break it all down and go back to basics. Whereas I feel like anti-natalism, just in this context of bullshit jobs and Homo Deus, is kind of an alternative to that solution. It's like, instead of breaking everything down and going back to basics, we should just get rid of it. So that's like the context I can provide for the viewer.
Yeah, so Ted Kaczynski, Unabomber, like known for, attempts to murder various members of, I think it was like logging companies, and, basically, he was very strongly in favor of environmental protection. It's very hard to kind of identify his particular tendency, and I think, he does have a very sort of individualist streak with him, and so in a sense to like give credit to that, I do think it's kind of hard to like apply a label to him, maybe like anarcho-primitivist, but he specifically rejected that. Like this is while in jail.
Really?
I think he still has
that,
been
because
writing.
that's what I would have assumed to call him.
I think because it has such a strong leftist kind of association, and he's very against that. He doesn't specifically delineate his position against. I think he's actually written on this subsequent to being arrested, actually, on why his disagreements with the leftist and anarcho-primitivist kind of movement. But yeah, he observes this trend of technology, which is that once a new technological development is introduced into the world, it's or in his position, almost impossible, except for this total regression. And so there's this kind of this ideological rejection of the idea of, perhaps going back to the Enlightenment, and in line with this transhumanism, which is kind of a modified version of that, of like, this drive to progress and so on. Once a new technological innovation is brought into the world, it's very hard to recant on that. An example that I believe comes from Sam Harris, I don't remember, it's just a little anecdote. He was talking about how, or whoever it was talking about how he went on a flight to somewhere and there was Wi-Fi on the aeroplane, and this was like a new thing. Everyone was really excited about that. Like, wow, we have Wi-Fi in the airplane. We're in the future, man. And then, about halfway through the flight, the Wi-Fi shuts down, and everyone's just, there's this sense of anger, like an injustice has been committed. Like, fuck, we don't have this Wi-Fi anymore. Like, so it was so how quickly they became acclimatized.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. I think that this ties into, an important claim about human nature itself and about human desire and human pleasure, that it is this process of regression to the mean. We don't sort of build up from there, and every technological innovation we create kind of makes us more and more satisfied. I mean, Kaczynski would argue it's sort of the opposite. It takes away our own autonomy.
Yeah.
But on some level, to make a milder position just for now, what I'm saying is that there's just this regression to the mean in the same way that all pleasure has this kind of tendency where you look forward to the future. You say, when I achieve X, Y, and Z, I'm going to be at this new plateau of pleasure, and then I will be happy. And then you reach that point, and it plateaus very quickly. Psychologists have shown that this is true for people who win the lottery, and this is true for people who
That's a great example.
People who like become a paraplegic or something. Like, it's not the exact point, but it's very similar. You might be mildly less, over a long period of time, once you've learned to cope with it, you might be mildly less happy than you were before. But it's not this. It's never as much as you expect. Is the key point.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to come on, little Timmy. You won't eat your broccoli for dinner, but there's kids starving in Africa. It's sort of, not that I know that much about Buddhism, but it's kind of a shame that, as far as I'm aware, Kaczynski hasn't really talked about Buddhism. Because you could almost propose that as another alternative, because it immediately starts with this acceptance that I think personally I agree with, that the root of suffering is, at the very least to a large extent, desire. And as soon as you have something, you always want something more, there's never enough money. I think, he does actually write about, I believe he talks about, billionaires are the greediest people, and they are the ones that want money the most, which is kind of interesting.
It's I think that's tied into his idea of the power process, and I forget the term he uses, but surrogate activities, right? That's the term.
Exactly.
So for him, to briefly recant, I might need a bit of help here because it's just been a little while since I've read it, but he's talking about the meaning, what he sees as the meaninglessness of modern human life, because we have all the means we need for survival. If you want to just survive, if that's your total set of goals, there's a very, all you need to do is basically follow orders. You need to do whatever you're told to get X qualifications, to get some kind of work.
You mean in kind society?
Yeah. And then you just follow this schematic or algorithm, as Yuval Noah Harari would say, to you follow that set of instructions on how to achieve a desired outcome, and then you're done. Very simply, you go to work, and he kind of has these critiques of capitalism, which he doesn't quite express as capitalistic, but just as modern technology or whatever, which I actually think has some interesting merit to it. But he's talking about the alienating nature of work, how it's, in terms of specialization, it's so specialized that we don't need to, individual autonomy is not accounted for, and you can just merely be given a set of instructions to do some repetitive task or whatever. And then, so you've got your survival done, right? Mm-hmm. So this feeling of, I think he's saying in primitive times, it would take so much more energy and investment, and you need to develop certain skills in order to achieve that survival. And then that was a truly fulfilling activity because it was, about exercising your autonomy, what he calls the power process, kind of like Nietzsche's will to power, I think. So, basically there's no kind of outlet for that, and it has to be sublimated, which he literally uses that term, and that's a Freudian term, sublimation, in which, for instance, a sexual desire becomes transferred or transformed, sublimated into a different type of activity. So it could be, this is kind of on the notes here, but something like producing music. He does specifically mention the creation of art. You could say people's ambition to even something like money, right? But yeah, sorry, just to get back to the point, I'll finish up quickly, but the point about money, he's saying, for a certain set of people, acquiring money is a surrogate, is more of a, it's like, it can be a surrogate activity for lots of people, but there's just people who take it to that next level, and that's those kind of billionaires types, those Jeff Bezos types, where they just can't get enough. And that's true of all of us, but somehow they've just taken it to the next level.
Well, the power process is basically defined in this way, so it's a process. So you have a goal, right? And in primitive times, the goal would literally just be survival, right? And then you have to expend effort into that goal. So primitive times, you have to, we use the example of hunting a boar. That is not easy. Persistence hunting, where you have to run for hours, or if you're foraging, like neither of those are easy. Like to the extent that like if you or I were put into like some island where we had to survive by ourselves after 19 years of not having to do that, like it's quite possible that we would just die, whereas a primitive human would thrive. So then you have the attainment of the goal, and that's where satisfaction comes from. That's fulfillment of the power process. And then he has another point, which is autonomy, which he says not everybody needs, but it's relevant. And so these days we basically don't have any autonomy.
And that's basically referring to one form of alienation, which Marx talks about. Basically, they're kind of just using different words for the same thing, although his term covers more concepts, alienation, but in one sense it's this lack of autonomy on, stereotypically the production line or whatever, where you're set to do some specific task and there's a very specific way in which you have to do it.
He like basically mentions existentialism and says it's a response to modern life. He talks about like this is kind of based off nothing. He just kind of says it. Although to be honest, I agree. Like in general, I think there's a lot of truth to a lot of what he's saying in the book. Like I disagree with his conclusion, but like just some of his analysis is like sounds very true. So for example, I like definitely agree that the power process is probably quite true, quite profound. I'm not really sure I stand on this, but he says that in a primitive time, people go through their life completing this power process, and then when it comes time for them to die, they can accept it. Whereas in modern life, we never really get to complete the power process. We just have these supplemental activities, which maybe is where our fear of death comes from. Which is interesting. I'm not really sure where I stand on that exactly. He talks about, like, so we have so much physical security. This is related to what you were saying about, our basic needs always being fulfilled. But that's not necessarily psychological security. Like, we're in no danger of physical harm, but we're constantly being harmed psychologically. Kind of like bullshit jobs.
Yeah, and I think that's the exact point at which I disagree with him. It's just that I don't see why it has to be these activities that specifically, lead to your survival. It's very opposed to that kind of like maybe hierarchy of needs type thinking, where we satisfy lower needs in order to achieve, some kind of greater, more kind of profound need, rather than just our material survival. But he's sort of inverting that pyramid, where he's saying these lofty goals are, fairly meaningless, except when, because I assume you wouldn't say that's true of his own writing, for instance. That's because it's geared towards this desire to materially impact the world and, achieve his, ideal sort of primitive society.
That's kind of interesting. I feel like maybe I don't fully understand you, but I feel like we potentially disagree here. You said that he wouldn't say that about his own writings. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I feel like he kind of, because his writings are more than just like producing art, right? He's like essentially trying to spark a revolution.
Yeah, no, that was my point.
Okay. Oh well, sorry. All right. Then I think I basically accept that.
Like he goes after certain classes of scientists. Like this is one thing that's also quite quite a big claim that he makes, which is not super substantiated. But I do want to make it clear I do like a lot of what he has to say, and I think it's kind of a great just impetus for conversation. It really does kind of make you think, even if just to have to be forced to articulate these reasons, these things that for you are just kind of unassumed assumptions, unchallenged assumptions, and you can kind of just stroll through your life kind of just like believing those things, and he challenges a lot of that. But he talks about like scientists, which he sees a lot of science, perhaps all of science, as a surrogate activity, which is a strong claim. But
I think like the way he's defined the power process and surrogate activity, I think it makes sense and is essentially correct there.
But he's sort of specifically digging into like people who are in these more esoteric fields, which is purely for the sake of knowledge that isn't done to some other aim. So it's that I don't think he's against these more indirect forms of the power process, but only insofar as they are geared towards some kind of material survival. Do you see what I mean? So if you're making science, let's say it's really primitive science, the science of agriculture or something like that. So studying that in order to increase your yield because, occasionally you have a famine and half the village is wiped out, that's very different for him than being interested in paleontology or entomology just because you want to increase the field of knowledge that, and a few people are going to read your papers or whatever.
Okay.
So I think we're on the same page about that.
Yeah. Something that just popped into my head is like, let's say we all agree with Ted Kaczynski and we do this revolution. What is there to stop society building up? I feel like this kind of links into transhumanism, which Ted Kaczynski does talk about. He talks about genetically engineered humans, and us essentially, like, let's say we're plugged in, so we're in Ted Kaczynski's ideal life. Like, I feel like that's kind of could be the transhumanist rebuttal, that like we should just advance society, right? And then we can build like either we're all plugged into a simulation
of being an anarcho-primitivist.
Yeah, right?
That's genius.
Like, it's kind of hilarious. It's like the best of both worlds.
Wow.
Or like maybe we all get shipped off to a different planet where we're anarcho-primitists and there's like robots watching us, and if we start developing too much they can like fuck us off.
Wow, this sounds very similar to an idea of obviously you've come at it yourself, but yeah, we'll talk about that after the podcast, but that sounds very similar to an idea a friend of mine has.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to derail, but I just do want to bring up this point about you're talking about the fear of death, and I think he's in sort of good standing there in terms of, there's other people who have written on this. So Christopher Latch in his book The Culture of Narcissism talks about, generally he sees, I don't know that if he's a psychoanalyst exactly, but he sees these particular types of pathologies, because he does talk about neuroses and stuff. So he's talking about how in sort of, I want to say like maybe the early 20th century, 19th century, the kind of neuroses that are experienced by people, and it's typically people of like middle class and above, is kind of this repression of sexuality. It's like, covering up the legs of tables in your kitchen or whatever because it's like obscene. So the neuroses came because people weren't able to release their libidinal or sexual energies. They weren't able to express them. But now he sees it as like, the problem is kind of narcissism. It's this overemphasizing of like, how to put it? So yes, our sexuality has been released, and so that's, like, I just want to make it clear he's not sort of causally linking those two things specifically. It's just that of this particular time, repressed sexuality was the main sort of neurosis, sort of this over controlling of things, this the kind of the superego is too much in control of kind of the id.
By a particular time, do you mean Kaczynski or this book, Culture of Narcissism?
This book, yeah. But what I want to tie into the fear of death and everything, which, I'm sure it's probably not compatible. I'm sure Kaczynski would have a different analysis. But his point is kind of like, for whatever reason, I've been maybe missing a few points from this book. It's been a little while, but we have, the main neurosis of our time is that of narcissism, which I think is like, even on a basic level, is kind of compelling in terms of, and you see how...
When was this book written?
It's interesting, I forget, but it's decades ago.
Oh, okay.
So it's really ahead of its time, yeah.
My assumption would be that it would talk about, like, Instagram models. I know that's kind of a low-hanging
That's what
fruit.
we both, I think, thought of immediately, but you can see how it's and you can see how that produces this obsession with ourselves. It produces this this anxiety, this feeling of narcissism is not exactly like pleasure, exactly. You know what I mean? It's like you're too invested in yourself, in your physical appearance, and what other people think of you. And if you see a wrinkle or something, or that's one point, is like your physical appearance. If you're really invested in your physical appearance, that's something that's destined to decay. And so if you can't let go of that, you're going to have a really hard time in old age and death, because your autonomy is taken away, and you lose your own physical appearance. I think this tangent's going on a bit, but The point is that just other people have theorized on this, and they make the case that it's to do with kind of Western culture. Ernst Becker also touches on this a little bit in his book, The Denial of Death, which is talking about, he kind of espoused an early version of terror management theory, but he says that we subsume that need into these acts of what he calls heroism. So these narratives we give ourselves, these kind of life projects that disguises that need for that, inherent terror around death. Which I want to be clear, I don't really believe in terror management theory, but I really like this aspect of his thing where, and in a way it's kind of just existentialism, but you choose some kind of meaningful project. So that's the key difference with Kaczynski, whereas he would just say all this heroism bullshit, like something like fighting in a war or deciding to write great works of literature or fucking whatever, your project that you pursue wholeheartedly and kind of embodies a kind of sacrifice on your part, like you're giving your time, you're giving your energy, you may be giving your physical health to the pursuit of this thing. Yeah.
But we're all just supplemental.
Yeah.
Well, I guess fighting in a war...
Just very sort of nihilistic in a way.
Fighting in a war is kind of less supplemental activity, right? Like, that kind of is fighting for survival.
I disagree. Or it depends. Sorry. It's only because I have a certain examples of war that I'm drawing on, and it's not fair because you don't have my own associations around that term. But something like World War One, it wasn't really a fight for survival. It was a fight for kind of ideas, and so that's the point of this heroism: is you have a narrative, you have a self.
That's pretty true.
Yeah, you have a self that you've constructed, which actually kind of plays in a little bit to Homo Deus. So maybe we can segue from there. But the point is that the narrative, like you have the objective material circumstances. So in war, it's excruciating suffering. It's people losing, limbs. It's your friends dying in front of you. But what gets you through that, what redeems that experience, is that you have some narrative around it. So people have said that after World War II, fighting in the war was like the most profound thing they did in their entire lives, because they had this narrative that they were fighting Hitler, they were fighting the ultimate evil, and so, it's kind of this difference again between the interpretation of the world in itself, and then the interpretation, which on one level is our physical sense apparatus, which we kind of talked about earlier, not related to this conversation. And then the secondary things are like the more abstract, these stories of the way you view the world, and that in turn shapes the reality. So if you were to strip back that story, you would just have the suffering. But if you interpolate that, I don't know if that word means what I think it means, but we'll see. I'll look it up later. This narrative of the war, then you're able to sort of redeem or just transform that suffering.
Well, that's kind of what anti-natalism does. It strips back the story, like it completely...
It's deconstructive.
Yeah, it's not willing to accept, like... Well, I mean, it will, right? But, like, it's not that relevant to the thesis of, like, so anti-natalism, like, meaningful suffering. You kind of just look at the suffering, because there's also that backdrop of, like, okay, yeah, but, like, that's meaningful for the person that exists. But they could have alternatively just not come into existence. What exactly was you mentioned Homo Deus in there. What exactly is like the transition from your point to Homo Deus?
Yeah, so talking about conceptions of the self, because Yuval Noah Harari is like an experienced meditator. In a podcast he mentions that he will spend his holidays going on silent retreat, and he meditates like 2 hours a day or something.
That is insane.
So it kind of informs his worldview, I think, and I think it ties up with and I don't think he just drops it in there because it's an interest of his. I think it's because it's very intrinsically linked to this idea of technological progress and deconstruction. So we come to realize, something like, I wish I had a better example here, but something like, we were talking earlier about use of like stimulants, like ADHD medication, something like Ritalin. You come to realize that while I don't actually advocate for this, there's not necessarily any reason except for like, or if you could make a drug that, sorry to segue, if you could make a drug that would produce like pleasure all the time with no side effects, there becomes no reason not to use that all the time, even though we have some narratives about meaning, about, oh, well, maybe you should suffer sometimes, but it's all in these kind of utilitarian terms. It's just kind of the ideology of our times, it's like, maybe it ties in with what he's saying about Dataism, So it's all about what you can measure, what's kind of objective. And I would argue that the active interpretation, much like in my example about war, it actually affects the way you interface with the world. So in a sense, it changes the world. And what I'm trying to say about the self is like, science has also done that. So Buddhists had the experiential knowledge, the gnosis, in order to understand, subjectively that the self could be deconstructed, that it was not real. Now science has made the same step in proving something like the experiencing self versus the remembering self. We can look at neuroscience, so we can observe the way, like Sam Harris talks about in The Moral Landscape, different beliefs are evaluated, like religious beliefs and scientific beliefs are like processed by the same, part of the brain or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So the science itself leads to this construction of the self. Do you take that point? Have I explained that clearly?
Yeah.
So once we're subsumed within this way of looking at things purely in terms of data, it becomes only logical to move towards transhumanism. That's my view.
Yeah, but you have to look at alternatives. So I accept your view, but the interest for me comes out of comparing that to, we haven't really put the ideas up against each other yet. We should come back to that, but the interest for me comes in comparing that to Kaczynski's idea, or against, say, anti-natalism, which kind of is in another category to me.
Yeah, I think I've maybe presented a false dichotomy here. Yeah.
But before we pit the ideas against each other, you mentioned, say once we have these drugs to increase performance, one thing that's interesting to me is, for viewers, I just want to accept that the viewpoint I'm about to express is very much against mainstream science. I do plan on doing a video explaining why I've come to this conclusion in the future, but for now, just roll with it. But if we talk about antidepressants, so from the knowledge I've gathered so far, I'm not really on board with them. It's interesting, Yuval Noah Harari seems, I'm sure it's probably not something he's looked very deeply into, judging by just how vague the statements he makes on them are. But it sounds like he very much believes the narratives of antidepressants, that depression is just some sort of chemical illness, and that we have these drugs that essentially fix it. He also made statements similar to that in the Sapiens, which is kind of the prequel to Homo Deus. I think that's also sort of relevant to bullshit jobs. I watched a video the other day by this anti-natalist YouTuber, who I'll link in the description. I can't really remember, but his channel is Sean something. But he made a video and he was just essentially expressing grief about how boring his life is. He goes to work and after childhood, he's essentially putting the most pessimistic view forward, but he's just expressing this deep boredom with his life. And someone in the comments essentially recommended that he try antidepressants, and I'm kind of thinking no, you're missing the point, even if we accept that antidepressants will relieve these symptoms, it's I'm sure Ted Kaczynski would agree that life is not really meant to be like this.
I think that's the point I'm trying to make, and maybe it is a little too simplistic, but do you see how, at least for me, that's in line with humanist, and in particular transhumanist, I say ideology, I just mean way of thinking about the world. People have very disparaging understandings of ideology as being doctrinaire or whatever. For me, it's just kind of your implicit worldview or whatever. kind of in line with Slavoj Žižek's definition, but
Not to derail you, but that's like something that I find very interesting in Homo Deus, that he kind of insists on calling humanism or communism religions. He uses that word.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. Well, then I have to give him some credit. So, just feel to jump in here if you feel like this characterized him, because you're right. He does sort of lay out. He does try to be quite objective in saying he's not even really condemning of something like communism, even like state communism, which I have a shit ton to reject, like most of that project. But even he's from memory quite neutral about it. He's just kind of saying, this is a tool of analysis, a way of seeing the world, whatever. But so I don't know what he would say. He might actually have a good argument against this that fits within his worldview. But in terms of transhumanism, I feel like that view of depression is very in line with Dataism. It's very in line with that, which he is critical of, to be fair, of that ideology of seeing things purely in terms of data and of disregarding human experience. I think that logically leads you to that view of antidepressants. There's no intrinsic meaning to these human experiences which have led you to be in this state of depression. It is merely, once we have the right data, it is merely a set of chemical imbalances to be cured with a pill that will correct that problem.
Maybe I don't fully understand, but I don't really see how one leads into the other. Like, do you mean? Okay, so now we're kind of in this worldview of like simply like processing data. I think where I lose you is like the like chemical imbalance thing that's kind of a leap. Like, that's not based off any science.
It's a type of data. I think maybe where we're getting tripped up here is I'm not making this claim about the current current antidepressants. I'm just saying if we had a theoretical antidepressant. Sorry if I'm not making this clear.
Okay.
That would, just cure depression with no side effects and would work on healthy people to make them happier. Let's just say to be at the risk, yeah.
Well, that is a very real possibility for the future.
Let's just say it's just serotonin. I'm not saying I believe this. So, we've analyzed your body. You have subjectively you're experiencing depression, but that doesn't mean anything to us. So we need to understand that quote unquote objectively as a kind of data. So we measure your levels of different chemicals, and we notice that your serotonin is unusually low. This fits in with our theories about depression, and so then we say, well, in response to this data point, we need to just merely shift this data point, to give you a quote unquote normal level of serotonin, and then that will kind of solve the problem. So it's like a way of thinking, and that's what I mean when I say, or it's one of the things I say when I mean transhumanist ideology, which I think is synonymous with what he's calling like Dataism.
Well, I think Dataism is kind of, from my understanding, seems to be more so like that the goal of life, like the meaning of the universe, is simply to like process data, which seems to be like learning, expanding scientific fields, seeing like different ways we can interpret certain things. One thing that like was kind of like incredibly based was he talked about one guy that published like hundreds of thousands of scientific articles so the whole world could just access them. And that's sort of like accelerating this data processing thing. But
I just want to shout that guy the fuck out.
Yeah.
Like, rock on, dude. Like, open access.
I think he did like kill himself because he got.
Was that
found out.
Aaron Schwartz? Open
Yes.
Access Manifesto. Yeah.
I
Rest in peace.
really looking forward to reading that. But yeah, the JSTOR that he got all the scientific articles from actually like made so many more of their scientific articles like public now because of Aaron Schwartz. So as I've said before, we've got like this particular narrative, this way of like perceiving our current day, where at the moment we're in this capitalist society, we're doing these bullshit jobs, we're kind of just expanding. Homo Deus takes that and says, where are we going to go from here, right? So if we go from bullshit jobs to Homo Deus, at the end of bullshit jobs, I mean, David Graeber seems very on board with like preserving autonomy. He talks about like maybe UBI at the end, but like sort of to my frustration, he doesn't really propose solutions. Homo Deus, I guess the only real solutions that he proposes is, well, I don't know if he proposes this as a solution, but he, like when we talk about transhumanism, it's very hard to not get the sense that it's inevitable. Like inevitable in the sense that we are definitely going to have the capability to live in pleasurable simulations, and inevitable that once we have that, we're definitely going to want to go into it and do it. Maybe this is just me being reactionary, but I almost want to fight back against like that really being possible. I mean, I know we have VR at the moment, but it's nothing like uploading your consciousness.
I think, and I would take a fairly, I almost want to say nihilistic, but not in the sense of a moral nihilism, which some people may see as an inconsistency. I mean, we've kind of talked about that, but what my thesis here is that it's once you have a certain way of viewing the world, which is this in terms of data, in terms of utility maximization, you're logically led down a certain route. So that's what I'm identifying as the cause for this phenomenon you describe. And I agree, it's very visceral. I feel this all the time. Like there's some kind of teleological leap that we're just, we're just being caught up in this big wave, and this shift is inevitable. And so like, and it seems that autonomy has to go along with that. Like he's talking about, I think this is from the book, something like self-driving cars. Like we can talk all we want about this, the majesty of human autonomy and meaningful experiences and stuff, but our desire to have control over driving our own cars, rather than allowing autonomous, algorithms to control an entire grid of cars, means that many thousands of people die every year from car accidents. So. And it's kind of a hard argument. It's kind of hard to push against that. I think you can, but it's pretty brutal, right? Like, to say like, well, we have, us particular. The problem is that meaning is so fluid. So you can envision a society with, with this idea of meaning over utility or whatever, over just pure. We're just gonna fucking go for utility. There's no human meaning at all. Let's just go utility and pleasure. I think in terms of, there's maybe a few subjective judgments you would have to make, and maybe that's another error of this ideology. But if you're going for utility maximization, I feel like you have a fairly good sense of like what that society would look like. Whereas this meaning society, I think you could have so many different instantiations because it is ultimately about human subjectivity.
Analyzing the future is so complex. Like, I feel like we maybe like have to separately analyze like this transhumanist future versus like any alternative future. Yuval Noah Harari talks about like I love public transport, right? But he talks about a carpool system where like you say have your phone and a self-driving car comes, picks you up, takes you to work, and then isn't like parked on the road taking up space, and it can pick someone else up.
It's a brilliant idea. Like I'm sure many people have had it. It's more enacting it, but it's a brilliant idea.
I feel like that is like almost like definitely going to happen in the future. But if we talk about like living in simulations, for me personally, like it's so hard to say. Like I'm sure there are people that definitely believe that's what's going to happen. But I don't really know where to go from there. So I could also accept that like we'll just end up being like slaves to machines and having like a completely meaningless life.
I don't know why the machines would bother though when they just make more machines to have machine slaves.
Well,
humans aren't even good slaves once you can make buff as shit robots or like human robot hybrids or mutants or something.
Potentially. Well, one theme that's very consistent between both Homo Deus and the Unabomber Manifesto is that like this technological process it's actually like literally the same point in both books. It's like very consistent. Like the more we develop, like we become more efficient, but that doesn't necessarily translate at all into human pleasure. Transhumanism is kind of just like this ideology for human pleasure. And I kind of wonder what's going to happen with that. Like, are we going to, maybe if we like try to merge that with antinatalism, like, are we going to plug all the animals into simulations? Or are we going to like maybe wipe out all life on Earth except for humans, and then humans live in simulations, you know?
To be really clear, just for the audience, like when you say wipe out, you just mean phased extinction.
Oh yeah.
You wouldn't need to kill a single animal, you could just wait until they died out.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of good.
Yeah, it's like, it's just really tough to like see where we're going. So I feel like we have to come up with a hypothetical future scenario and then analyze that. So like right now, let's take transhumanism and then sort of compare it to our own personal philosophies. Like, where do you stand on that?
That's a really, really big question, and it's a really good question.
Oh yeah.
It's sort of tough. I think very possibly it's really just a defense of my own ego, because I have certain things, goals in life I want to pursue to contribute. It is kind of more like, I believe people like this exist, but at the end of the day I don't necessarily know if I'm one of them, who are like motivated purely by this, or mostly by an ethical concern for others. So they'll do, pursue a career or whatever in order to benefit society, not for their own, or it comes prior to their own fulfillment or whatever. But basically it's...
I think that sort of relates to like, fighting in World War II against like this ideology of Hitler. Like obviously people literally sacrificed their lives for that. So I think there is a bit of us in that.
But yeah, I mean, honestly, where I come at this is just like, I don't want to be made obsolete. So, I don't know at the end of the day if I have a good argument against this. Like, it's just, just that exactly. Something like, he actually talks about this, which I wanted to bring up with you. He talks about an algorithm that would compose music. It's like, it just takes in a shit ton of, and particularly, I mean, the clincher is, people will just say, oh, it's a machine, you'll always be able to know. Well, they proved, like, people didn't know.
That like...
So game over.
At least bear with us in this process. Like, we have to, like let's forward proceeding. Like, we have to accept that, like, art can be made by robots better than humans.
Like, humans will not be able to tell. It's Turing test, basically. We won't be able to distinguish the difference between art created by a sophisticated algorithm, which can also be incredibly prolific, and art created by a human.
Well, this is kind of, and maybe this relates back to bullshit jobs, because in the last podcast, we talked about like, okay, let's say we fix this bullshit jobs problem, or like we establish some sort of communist utopia. Like, what do we do all day? Like, are we going to paint? Okay, and now we have this issue added into the mix of like, I mean, I'm not saying that there's no point making art in this scenario, but like, when robots can make art better than us, then it's kind of like, well, now there's even less to do. I guess we just accept it and plug ourselves into the simulation.
Actually reminds me of Lee Sedol, the ninth dan Go player who lost to AlphaGo, the first person to lose to a algorithm.
I finally got around to watching AlphaGo very recently. It was like I take some issues with the documentary. It was like very basic and that, but like honestly, I did want to cry at one point. Like, it was like very powerful.
Yeah, I think it works great as it's not just informative, but on the affect level of affect as well. Like, it's and I think it's accessible to kind of everyone. Like an algorithm that beats someone in Go. It doesn't sound like something that is very, I don't know, just like. But I feel like everyone can get something out of this because it, and like you say, that's part of the flaw. But I think it's part of like what they're going for. It's like anyone, you don't have to. it doesn't delve much super deep into like how they create the algorithm and the technical aspects of that, but that would be a more specific documentary, which is not a bad thing, but it's just what it would be. So Lee Sedol chose to retire from Go playing about a year after losing to the AlphaGo algorithm. So it was like he saw, and it's interesting because this hasn't happened with chess. People still play chess. I think chess is like maybe even like more popular than it's ever been, or not ever, but I mean I think it's experiencing some kind of resurgence due to like these like chess streamers on Twitch and like like I have been sucked into this kind of world just through the sheer like popularity of it. But so the response to like it's no longer possible to beat an engine at chess has been to just like create different spheres of competition. Like yes, there's computers, and I think there's I don't know how it works exactly, but there's people who work with algorithms to like generate strategies that kind of require a human element and a computer or something like that, or types of analysis. But people didn't stop playing chess in 1980 in the 90s. You know what I mean? That wasn't the end of chess. So that's kind of an interesting counterpoint.
Yeah. Maybe this isn't too relevant to the overarching theme of the podcast, but I've just been like, did you ever play Ratchet and Clank?
No.
Okay. So I had a PlayStation 2 when I was very young. We played these games called Ratchet and Clank. It's basically like the game is built in levels. It's like you have a whole bunch of fun guns to shoot enemies with. There's some platforming in it. But there's this whole subculture of Ratchet and Clank speedrunning. So mostly the first like 3 original sort of trilogy of games. And I just came across it and I watched a speedrun of the 3rd Ratchet and Clank game, which was done in like about half an hour. And it was like mind blowing, like half an hour as opposed to 9 hours. So it like clips through walls and goes to like, like special places, like skip half the level. And then I also saw a TAS, which is tool assisted speedrun, that came out very recently, which is when but essentially it's a human doing it, but he's gone through the game like frame by frame, so he can do like frame perfect glitches. So like a specific glitch that has to be executed perfectly, he can do that. And then it's even more insane. Like he beat the whole game in 20 minutes. Like it would be really interesting to like run some machine learning through that and like see what they do. I don't really play games, but I played some Agar or Agario, not really sure how you pronounce it, agar.io. Essentially you're this blob and you can eat some pellets on the ground, but you can eat blobs smaller than you can get eaten by blobs bigger than you, and it's a multiplayer game. So I've been playing some of that recently and been coming up with strategy, but it's been in my mind like, wow, like, if I was one of those people that knew how to program a machine to learn, I would be really interested in seeing like, could a machine just beat everyone at this game?
I don't know if this is a solution for the whole issue we're faced with here, because we are restricting our conversation to games, but there is a good example where like, why would you want to watch, say, a computer do a speed run? Their perfection, it's only interesting because of human limitations. You can use the assistant of technology to find out what is the optimal strategy and how do I execute that. But when it comes down to it, something like athletic performance, you could use all these technologies to, obviously we have the realm of science, but even if that were taken over by entirely by artificial intelligence, the problem there is that like, it depends how you weigh these things, right? Like, do you see, this is a rhetorical question, like, the exploits of an athlete versus that of a scientist. If we remove the realm of science and put that over to AI, how do we weigh those two things? So that would be another thing you could add to the category. It's still like not even close to a satisfying answer, but yeah, so we have artistic endeavor, we have athletic, pursuits, we have sports, we have games. You want more than that in a human life, but the point being, all I'm trying to say is that, we do have these specific things where the limitations themselves are what make things interesting and compelling.
Yeah.
what would be the point of having a 100-meter, a droid run the 100-meter slide?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure that will be a thing. I mean, there are literally races. Part of that is like the person driving the car.
I guess you could have competing AI, right? If they designed different droids.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, there are like competitions like, fastest, like it's like, like the fastest vehicle and all that. Like there is a sort of human interest in observing that. Probably the most difficult question that I think I've made my mind up is, so we live in this transhumanist world. I feel like at that point, maybe it's less compelling. Like, if I view this all from my anti-natalist philosophy, which is essentially that it would be best if life didn't exist. Transhumanism, we're plugged into this ecstasy simulation. I guess I have to be basically on board with that. But then I also feel like maybe not better, but we may as well just not exist if we're gonna do this whole transhumanist thing. And so if we go right to the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned like, okay, what if life doesn't exist and we pass the torch to AI? I guess I don't really see an issue with that as long as they're
I'm not saying there's also I just want to be clear, I'm not saying there's even a compelling reason to do that.
Yeah,
it's kind of neutral, right?
That's kind of, I would consider that neutral, but I don't really see the point of doing it. Like,
but what's the point of not doing it?
Well, maybe that would sort of compel vegan space scientists to, but yeah, like, I don't know, I guess once everything becomes neutral, it's a bit hard to pull apart. Like, ask yourself seems like when, at least...
As a YouTuber.
Yeah, ask
and
yourself, a YouTuber. Yeah. When anti-natalism is brought up, he seems to, like, he has many objections to it. He's definitely not an anti-natalist, but he seems to somewhat want to bring up the transhumanist point. At that point, I feel like it's kind of neutral. Like, we're also missing the point. Like, how much suffering is there going to be before we reach this transhumanist utopia? Like, I don't want, like, even if I can like say, all right, anti-natalism. Another issue with that philosophy is that it's probably not going to happen. So if we just accept that anti-natalism is never going to happen, and I can be like, all right, I'll settle for transhumanism, I'm still not going to like have kids that are going to suffer until transhumanism is a thing. And once we're in this transhumanist utopia, assuming that we're only experiencing pleasure, vegan space scientist seems to have the belief that, all right, at that point we should create as much life as possible because the mere existence of pleasure in the universe is a good thing. Whereas I don't share that belief at all. I feel like as much life as possible is equal to no life.
Right, but I think that equation, I think sometimes you're not, I don't know, I just, that process of equalization works both ways. So like we just talked about with, or even to provide an analogy, which may not actually be necessary, but, Hamilton Morris, this pharmacologist who's been on Joe Rogan, who's just a generally interesting dude, has a show called Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. He talks about how just like, he just made this comment that, is it heroin? No, methamphetamines is very similar to like Ritalin, chemically speaking. But that similarity has to run kind of both ways. So the reaction is like, one possible reaction is, oh, people who are on Ritalin, they're on meth. And that's crazy, like holy shit. But then it's like, well, people on meth, they're on Ritalin. Like, obviously not literally true, but in the sense that someone can take Ritalin and actually, if they have ADHD, enter a more calm kind of focused state, and they're not bouncing off the walls, and they're not engaging in violence or whatever. That same potential exists for methamphetamines. I think it's a lot to do with, set and setting and what our ideas of like the effects of drugs, lead those effects to become. And interestingly, wow, that's kind of interesting. Like, that itself kind of is a push against an element of this worldview that we've been discussing, the idea of set and setting in the process of taking drugs, because it's not reducible to the chemical effects that we would expect, generally speaking. I don't want to take that point too far. Okay, like let's be really clear on that. Like, you know, you can't just have. I don't think you can have any experience. You know, I don't think you're going to. I don't think if you believed hard enough that, you know, this caffeine pill would make you trip balls, that you would actually trip balls, right? But we've talked about alcohol before. You can talk about the placebo effect. So it's true that it isn't just reducible to, and you know, maybe you could just incorporate that at a higher level into, you know, some utilitarian, you know, whatever. Do you see what I mean? Is that making sense?
Sort of. Like, are you essentially making the point
Like,
that
I can provide you a pill, and we can analyze all the data that we have about this pill, what its chemical composition is, and we can analyze everything we, you know, with all the instruments we have about you, and make some predictions about how it's going to affect you. But ultimately, your interpretation, your mediation of what you think this drug will do to you, will lead to, like, the outcome is unclear because of that mediating factor.
is your point essentially that, like, okay, I don't see the relevance to the anti-natalism, transhumanism dichotomy.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to, and I don't specifically, you know, yeah, obviously the burden of proof is on me to make this point, and I don't know if I'm fully there, but I'm sort of seeing examples in which, you know, genuinely, because, you know, I think my case against that would have to be against even just like something like utilitarianism, although I'm pretty, I wouldn't say I have a particular coherent worldview. I think I just kind of like fall into different ways of thinking. I kind of see them as like tools, and so you can, you know, you use a different tool for a different job, so you use a different type of interpretation. But my general thing is that, like, the way you interpret things affects how they are in reality to some extent. So, and that's something we observe in the placebo effect, and it's something we observe in the heroism that we talked about earlier in kind of, you know, these World War kind of contexts. So that's an alternate worldview to the Dataist or the transhumanist kind of ideology of we can only to put aside human meaning and pursue just like material, and you know, you've got to make some concession to that. I'm not going to say, I was thinking about this earlier, like, could you make the argument, it's going to sound really stupid, but, you know, from like a Buddhist perspective or something like that, or a Stoic perspective where your joy only comes from your internal mental states and how you, purely in how you react to things, so purely through the act of interpretation, couldn't you be equally, isn't there an equal potential for happiness in any given individual at any point in history? Assuming they have access to this particular worldview or these techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to give, I think, you know, for me, I have to give some precedence to the idea that, like, well, if you have a fucking broken arm, or you're, I don't know, you have cystic fibrosis or something, and you live in 1500 and there's zero chance of that ever being cured. I mean, I don't think it's curable now. That in a, you know, if you was to take this same person and everything and transplant them to the world in which cystic fibrosis is like the common cold, or what, like it can just be cured like that, or it's just a single, you know, what's the word? Single, those diseases that are related to like a single gene, you know. So whatever, it's, you know, you're born into a society in which that's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously, I still think that's better. I'm just trying to make this case for interpretation, because we've seen that it's true at lower levels, which is the example I'm trying to bring up about the placebo. But we can move on if you like, because I feel like I need to think about that a bit more.
Okay, sure. Let me just think of where to take this.
Oh, I have a little fun factoid that I'd like to bring up, just based on a podcast I absolutely love that I just got into, called Weird Studies. Check them out; they're awesome.
Sorry, what was that?
Weird Studies.
Weird?
Weird, yeah. They talk about, they're very well read. They talk about, like, they bring in a lot of, it's kind of philosophy and art and a lot of things. They do film analysis, music analysis. They talk about the occult a lot, which I like a lot, and like magic and the tarot. Yeah, I saw your expression there. But they were talking about castrati as an early form of transhumanism, because so do you know what?
Yeah. Like
so,
this, you can explain it, but you explain it and then I'll ask.
Yeah, so as because they had their testicles removed from an early age. These children in Italy, I believe it was, and it didn't just. Here's the thing that I didn't know. It didn't just affect your voice. It affects the structure of your bones. It made their chest kind of expand in this weird way, and it created this huge kind of cavity that they could fill with air. Some of them, I meant to look up the photos. I haven't looked into it, but apparently, it would affect the structure of their jaw. Their bones wouldn't stop growing. It's like when you go from a child. You know how you have less bones as you get older?
Mm-hmm.
They fuse together. It's something like they don't fuse and they just keep growing.
Wow.
So their fucking jaws would like expand. Like some of them didn't look human apparently. So even though it was like pretty horrific in one way, it was literally like they could do things no one else could do because of these physical changes engineered to their
Wow.
bodies. And then another example I'll just drop really quickly was there's this Genesis Porridge, who is this artist musician from a band called Throbbing Gristle, who was an early industrial act. I don't know their gender pronouns, so I have to apologize for that. They embarked on this project with their partner in which they became like one another. They chose to have, it's like $200,000 of plastic surgery they invested into becoming identical.
Wow. Okay.
So these kind of like proto-transhumanists. So it's like, even though it's much more of like a thing now, it's really interesting that these resonances.
I mean, like there's the human Barbie and the human Ken doll. We sort of have these like sort of public figures in our modern day life. But when we come to like the topic of transhumanism as some kind of solution to human suffering, that's where I feel like, and practicality is a different thing. Like transhumanism is probably more practical than antinatalism. Like if I accept antinatalism is never going to be the reality, then I basically just accept, okay, we should increase pleasure and end suffering. But I do feel like almost frustrated that like really like we'll go through all this effort to do transhumanism, but like we won't consider a phased extinction. And if people have this idea of like living in a state of complete ecstasy in transhumanism. Well, I mean, some people are very frightened by it, but at least the promoters of it have this idea of it like it's the it's this sort of magnum opus of human civilization, and it's like once we were there, we've made it. Whereas for me, I feel like once we're there, we've kind of just, it's almost like a different route to antinatalism. Like, because I can't make you agree with this, or I'm not really trying to at the moment, but I would be happy to debate it at some point. That like, once we remove all the pain, pleasure is basically meaningless, so I don't really find it better than not existing. Perhaps like an easier analogy to accept is that like if we were just gonna plug every human into this simulation of like ecstasy, I feel like that's not really any better than just plugging them into like a dreamless sleep. Like if maybe we've milked that topic a little dry. I feel like relevant to the transhumanist topic is antinatalists often talk about pleasure in a dismissive way. So like, the pleasure of like eating food is really just like essentially there's no pleasure without pain preceding it. Most pleasure, well, often they make the case that all pleasure is just relieving pain, and that's something that I haven't really settled on. Like, I think it's true for a lot, and I mean, you could make the argument that like, if you never exist, you never want any pleasure. So then, yes, literally all pleasure is just relieving that. But ignoring that point, like, can you have pleasure without pain? Like,
I see what you're saying.
If I just went over to you and like started massaging you, right? It's not as if like you like had a craving to be massaged which was pain, that is now getting relieved by pleasure. So it almost appears like I've created pleasure out of nowhere.
It's funny, like I will sort of push against anyway, the example I wanted to give was like in terms of like bodily sensation, like I wonder if even though I'm going to eventually
this won't be a big detraction, but it is also very relevant to what you were saying before about once we get these pleasures, they immediately become insignificant to us.
So one thing I've noticed with like something like doing yoga, for instance, is that it kind of, I feel like you do get to that, you know, it is pleasurable to do, and then your body afterwards feels kind of like nice and limber and you know great, but it's kind of like there was really just an ambient level of discomfort that you weren't noticing, like so little that it wouldn't really matter, but it's still possible to kind of go beyond that. And you know, you could just invest, there's got to be some threshold obviously, but you know, what's to say, why would I stop there? Why would I not do another 20 minutes of yoga or whatever and experience, eventually it becomes diminishing returns kind of thing. But so that's one possibility. I was thinking though, like maybe it's true that all pleasure originates in some kind of relief of pain, but then you can go above a certain threshold and then it's more than simply the relief of that discomfort, like something like food. Like, see what you think here. Because in a way, we've all had the experience of being really hungry, and you basically don't give a fuck what you eat. Like, someone could present like a really nice, like your favorite food, or just some dog food, if you were hungry enough, honestly. There's that feeling though, don't you know? Like, or certainly the pleasure feels a lot greater than what it normally would be when you're really hungry.
Yeah, well, I think humans, once we exist, once we want pleasure, there's a case for intentionally doing it, right? Okay, like we like love this cycle of like being in pain and then getting pleasure. Like there's a case for intentionally like inflicting some sort of pain on yourself so that you appreciate the world more. Like maybe I'm sure there's someone out there that like locks themselves. Okay, like a dopamine fast. Have you heard of that concept? So it's essentially like you don't use your phone, you're not even allowed to read, and it means that once you come back, then you're suddenly so much more, like it's essentially used in the circles the way like productivity is sort of the goal. But like I feel like that's a great example of it.
Yeah, I think in a way I in some small way I do kind of dopamine intermittent fasting, in the sense, just as stupid a thing as like not being able to access YouTube and Facebook at certain times of the day. There could be a lot of reasons for this, but certainly as of late, because I think lockdown has played a huge part in this. Just having a routine, kind of repetition. Like I tend to, when I have to go to uni and take classes, like that physicality, and in a sense, even though it's like, I don't mean to like be super reductionist with this, but like in a sense the emotional labor of like interacting with other people, like it does tire you out. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Maybe that's a sacrifice that's like very worth making, but purely from the standpoint of like being productive or whatever, like that's, can be a little bit draining. So like, I notice I have sort of like a bit more focus and I'm able to, more consistently pursue my own projects or whatever. I think that has something to do with it, like just restricting use of these, very high dopamine activities to specific times of the day, kind of thing. So we're talking about pleasure. Yeah, basically, what is pleasure?
Yeah, it's tough.
The other example I would posit, okay, I think it's true if you're hungry enough. What if, but the thing is, I think food, so we think of this example. So you're mildly hungry and you have two options to sate that hunger, which will sate it in equal amounts, but one is just delicious and one kind of tastes bad. But let's say they're equally nutritious, like, so it's a hypothetical because this wouldn't necessarily, I was thinking like, a bad analogy would be like a chocolate bar and, like broccoli or something, even if we could get the nutrients. Well, no, the problem is that the nutrients aren't the same, or it's not as physically sating.
But this is a hypothetical.
Let's say we can correct for all of that.
Well, like,
you would still choose one over the other.
yeah. And then I guess, yeah, that sort of posits the question, like, right, like, then, you know, where is that excess pleasure coming from? Although, I suppose you could rebut it by saying, like, you're kind of just, so let's say, like, you have the pain of hunger, and then you have the pleasure of relieving food. If you assumed that the pain of hunger was like 10, maybe like the broccoli would be like a 5 of pleasure, and the chocolate bar would be like a 6, and you could never get exactly a 10. Or maybe you could get a 10, but you could never get an exactly 11. But now we come to this issue where it's like so hard, like we're trying to put numbers to things that are literally immeasurable.
Well, that's exactly it, though, right?
That's why I find it so hard to wrap my head against this one particular antinatalist argument.
But this is kind of my general point, the ephemeral nature of being unable to reduce these things to data. Like, people have shown that, like, the ambience, or like the, who you're with, or the memories, once again, this domain of meaning, when you consume a meal, contributes to the, even as we've observed, I think it's pretty clear that, like, cooking a meal yourself generally makes it taste better, or there's just some kind of surplus enjoyment there. So I don't know how you can reduce that to elimination of suffering. Yeah, I mean, unless you take some worldview of which, I mean, may be true. I mean, maybe that is what a Buddhist would say, that there's this level of ambient suffering in everything, constantly. I don't know that this is literally what is meant by, like, life is suffering. I think that's more to do with the pursuit of pleasure, and deferring your happiness to later, and, this traumatic event of getting what you thought you wanted and realizing it's not enough. But if you were to take this other worldview, which I'm not going to attach to anything at the moment for sheer lack of, for sheer ignorance, but that basically everyone's suffering all the time to an extent that can never be fully quenched, then you can make that case, right? Anything you do, even if it feels like this ambient thing, it's really just, you actually just really slightly uncomfortable and doing that yoga, like.
I think everyone is, like, always slightly uncomfortable. Like, I don't know, maybe
that's something I once. Oh yeah,
maybe this hardwood chair could, like, be a bit softer. Okay, like, if I exchange this for, like, some comfy gamer chair, like, does that mean that I'm in pain right now?
I sort of think so. Like, I mean, this chairs are pretty uncomfortable, so there's that.
Well, yeah. So it's like this, like, okay, so once we have some kind of permanent pleasure or fix, we immediately become accustomed to it, and it's insignificant. For example, this hard chair, if I did exchange it for a comfy gamer chair, I would very likely take it for granted. So what I'm wondering is, let's say we get plugged into this simulation where we're constantly experiencing pleasure. Is that even possible? Like, what could it possibly be? Like, I can't help but think.
Well, we talked about downregulation earlier. I don't know if that's where you're going with this. It might be a minor point, but presumably your dopamine receptors can't intercept this constant stream of the same level of dopamine. You would have to, like, up the dose.
Exactly, right? Like,
so it's in the nature of not just human, minds or whatever, or like, because that's more of an abstract thing. It's in human biology to regress to the mean.
When you drink alcohol, like, when you're, like, getting high off the alcohol, like, so if we take alcohol as, like, this upward slope of, like, you get drunk, progressively more drunk, then you peak, and then you sort of crash. Maybe this applies better to, like, another drug, but we'll just use alcohol for example. It feels, like, very nice when you're getting drunk. Like, that's really good, and then it's less good to, like, come down. So if we're plugged into the simulation, it's potentially would have to be, like, so it injects dopamine and serotonin into us, and has to keep doing that at a higher and higher and higher level until what? Until forever? Until we like naturally reach the end of our lifespan? What if like it can do that but only for 20 years? Should we just live for 20 years? Maybe we shouldn't bother with all this. Maybe we should just do the antinatalism thing.
I don't think this rebuts your point in any way, but maybe something like a reuptake inhibitor, like to stop, there's conceivably some kind of, because we're positing this very like basic, like just fucking slam the dopamine, like maybe there's some way of recycling that dopamine, but it doesn't at all rebut your point. It's not relevant.
I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but if we take an SSRI, psychiatrist Peter Breggin, who is anti-medication, he says that the serotonin kind of just puddles and the receptor becomes less sensitive to serotonin. So I wonder how realistic that is. I feel like in this transhumanist world, maybe it would have to be that, the suffering and then heaps of pleasure and then the suffering. And if that's the case, then that's not much better than real life. Like, potentially you could have all that. I believe in meaningful suffering. I think it's important for beings that already exist. So I think that could potentially be a step up from now. But then it has nothing on antinatalism. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm yet to hear a convincing description of a transhumanist utopia that is like entirely free from suffering.
Yeah, I think I think that's all I have to say on the topic.
All right, I'm happy to call it there. All right, thank you for watching. Leave comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear your points, and I'll try and write back. Please subscribe, like, share the video. Thanks for watching.